Hello, I'm Marcel Wieder, host of The Point. On this episode, we have former MPP and Cabinet Minister Steven Del Duca, who's seeking the leadership of the Ontario Liberal Party. Join us as we chat with him about his campaign. Hi, I'm Marcel Wieder, host of The Point. On today's show, we have Steven Del Duca, former MPP and Cabinet Minister, and a candidate for the Ontario Liberal leadership. Hello, Steven.
Great to be here, Marcel.
So, Steven, share with us a little bit about your background, where you grew up, what you were active in. I think people know you as a politician, but
Right.
There's more to you besides that.
Well, there is. I mean, you mentioned my legislative career, and you're quite right. For just about 6 years, I served as the MPP for Vaughan. The last 4 years that we were in power, I had the honor of serving as a cabinet minister. I've actually been very active in Liberal Party politics for a long period of time. And don't worry, I'll discuss my non-political activities as well in just a quick second. But I was 15 years of age when I first got brought into Liberal Party politics, and I turned 46 last year, so 31 consecutive years. In fact, somebody pointed out to me on the campaign trail that I've spent about 75% of my time on this planet as an active Liberal, and I'm proud of that. But I've lived now in Vaughan for about 30 years, give or take, first in Kleinburg, and now my wife and I are raising our young daughters in Woodbridge. And prior to moving to Vaughan, we lived in Etobicoke. I was born in Etobicoke. I lived there till I was about 14 or so years of age, 14 or 15. And then we moved up to Vaughan. So yeah, like I'm a GTA guy. I'm proud of the incredible province we have, and I love every single region, but I'm born and raised here in the GTA.
And your parents came to Canada in the late 50s?
My dad came from Italy in 1958 when he was 20, and my mom came from Scotland in 1961 when she was also 20, which means I've just accidentally told the world how old my mom is, so hope nobody tells her that I've done that. I don't want to get in trouble, but it's true. My parents came from Italy and Scotland, respectively.
Mm-hmm. And they met obviously in Toronto, and they ended up moving to Etobicoke and raising you?
No, actually, it's they met in 1961, not that many months after my mom arrived at a community dance on a Sunday afternoon.
It's very similar to my parents, how they met. Okay.
They started to date. Obviously, they courted. They fell in love. They decided to get married. They got married in 1964, July 1964, at St. Peter's Church, which is near the corner of Bathurst and Bloor. And shortly after getting married, they decided that they were going to move to Scotland.
Oh.
So late in 64, they moved back, for my mom, back to Scotland, where all of her family was. So when my mom came here at the age of 20, she was the only member of her family who was here, who was coming here and was here. And so in 1964, 65, they moved back to Scotland. They stayed there until 71. So my older sister and older brother were actually both born in Glasgow, Scotland. My parents came back in 71, first stayed with my dad's parents in the Keele and Eglinton area, and then bought the house that I was born into in Etobicoke, and I was the first one of our family born here in Canada.
Well, that's interesting. Honestly, I've known you for many years, but I didn't know the backstory.
Yeah.
And so where did you go to school?
So at my youngest years, I went to school, Wellsworth Public School, which is literally behind our house, and then off, I think it was in grade 3 or grade 4, I transferred over to Nativity of Our Lord. And then in grade 6, I joined my older brother, who was already downtown at De La Salle. And I was at De La Salle until back then grade 13. And so a bit of jumping around, but fantastic experiences in school throughout my primary and secondary years. At least that's my recollection. I'm not sure that my teachers would agree, but that's my recollection for sure.
Were you active in high school? Were you involved in any extracurricular activities?
So most of my extracurricular activity was actually based on politics or focused on politics. It makes me a little bit of a nerd in that regard because, as I mentioned, I was 15 when I first got involved in our party, but I also played hockey.
It's okay. I was 13 when I got involved in politics, so I have a few more years on you.
There you go. But I also played hockey. I played hockey outside of the school at the time in the old MTHL, the Metro Toronto Hockey League, and I also played for school. We were really lucky because we had an arena on the school property.
That's right.
Which made made it pretty awesome. We were on the ice on a fairly regular basis.
And so from high school, you went where for university?
I did first year of university at Carleton in 1992. That's when I started at Carleton. After first year, I decided to transfer back to Toronto, back to the GTA, and I went to the University of Toronto. I studied political science and history, and continued to be very, very active in politics, and kind of immersed myself pretty deeply in the politics of the GTA at all levels, municipal, provincial, and federal. And then many years later, when I was 30, I decided to pursue law, and I went to Osgoode Hall Law School and graduated from there in 2007, I believe, just a little bit older at that point in time. And in between the two academic experiences, I worked inside government at Queen's Park, but also for a couple of different federal cabinet ministers.
So you were primarily in Toronto, as opposed to going up to Ottawa to work, or did you?
I never worked in Ottawa, but
So
when I worked for both Maria Mina first and then Joe Volpe later on,
Right.
They were both Toronto ministers
Right.
in Chrétien and then Paul Martin's governments, and the minister's regional office, which is a bit of a hub for ministerial activity in downtown Toronto, is where I was stationed for both of them. And so that was the experience I had. I went to Ottawa frequently on their behalf or at their request, but I was physically based here in the GTA.
So you have a really good handle on Toronto politics, but you also have experience across the province in terms of working on various issues, and whether it was for the ministerials, for the ministers that you mentioned, but you also worked at Queen's Park on issues.
Yeah.
You want to share some of that?
Yeah, so my time at Queen's Park, my first job at Queen's Park was 1996, coincidentally as the party was going through a leadership renewal in the aftermath of the 1995 provincial election, which we as Liberals lost to Mike Harris. Our then leader, Lynn McLeod, made the decision that she wasn't going to stay, and that then plunged the party into a leadership process that began in the fall of 1995 and concluded about a year later, end of November, beginning of December 1996. And I was hired by a new MPP at the time, Anna Marie Castrilli,
Right.
to work as a special assistant in her office. That also gave me a front row seat to the leadership experience. Anna Marie was not the successful candidate. Obviously, we elected as a party Dalton McGuinty in 1996. I still have fond memories of that leadership journey and having a chance to travel the province literally with Anna Marie. We were a small campaign team, and that gave me the chance to work on all kinds of different aspects of a leadership campaign at 22, 23 years of age. Still remember the convention, and I know you do as well, at Maple Leaf Gardens.
Maple Leaf Gardens.
That went into
Until
the
2 a.m. or something like that, or
multiple
later.
ballots, and
Yes.
we emerged with a new leader who, in Dalton's case, went on to lead the party for 17 years.
Yes,
And
great run.
A great run. So I had the chance to work for Anna Marie, and then shortly after Dalton won the leadership, I was hired into the leader's office to be the field worker or the outreach staff person for the GTA. But of course, when you work for a provincial leader, you're on the road quite a bit. You're always chatting with your colleagues and with caucus members who represent every different kind of community. And stayed with Dalton until the 1999 campaign, which we were not successful in as a party. And then went on to work for Greg Sorbera. He was running for party president. I helped manage that election for Greg, and on it goes from there. Yeah.
So you've actually had a front row of watching the party rebuild after 95 with a leadership campaign, and then subsequently building up the resources of the party. So how does that compare from 95 to now in 2019-20?
You know, I think there are some similarities. So I watched the period between 96 and 99. I watched the period between 99 and 03. What I didn't mention in my sort of recitation of my bio just a second ago was that once Greg became party president, I then went to work for Maria Mina. So I left provincial politics for about 2 years. When Greg came back to the legislature as the MPP for then Vaughan King Aurora, because a by-election had been triggered when the former Conservative MPP Al Palladini died suddenly and tragically. When Greg came back as the MPP for Vaughan, he hired me as his executive assistant. He was the campaign chair for Dalton. He was the party president for Dalton. He literally had his hands on every aspect of the rebuild and the preparation for what was ultimately the 2003 provincial election campaign. So I've had the chance to witness rebuilding efforts when they fall short, and I've had the chance to witness and play a front role or have a front row seat, as you pointed out, on rebuilds that actually work. And so I think the big difference for us right now is that the heart of the Ontario Liberal Party is beating, and it's beating very strongly. And people understand how high the stakes are. I would say the one big difference between both the 95 to 99 window and the 99 to 03 window is that today we don't have the same resources directly at our disposal. And both of them, we're the official opposition party. Our caucus, more than 30. We have a stronger presence at Queen's Park than the numbers provide us with today. There were dozens and dozens of paid political staff, both at the party office and at Queen's Park, to help supplement or help provide a bit of a cushion for the party at large. Today, once we get through the leadership journey, once we renew our leadership in March, it really is going to have to be a volunteer political movement once again, kind of stripped all the way down to its core, to make sure that we're ready for an election campaign that's going to happen 26 months after we choose our next leader. So the work looks the same. We're starting off from a slightly weaker position. But because Liberals understand that the stakes are very, very high, I have seen a sense of resilience and determination throughout this campaign and all of our PLAs. We are up for this fight. We are ready for this fight. We will get the job done.
So let me ask, what do you think is the reason we're in the situation that we're in today? What happened in that election in 2018 that caused us to be where we are?
So I think after being in power for 15 consecutive years, obviously over time, the sense that there's a need for change builds within the electorate, and that was clearly evident, not just in 2018, I think it was evident in 2014 and even in 2011. That helps to explain why we were likely to lose the election. I think there is a difference between losing an election and being decimated by the electorate, being taken all the way down from 50 plus seats down to 7, where we ended up. And I think at the end of it all, voters felt that we had become very much stuck inside the bubble within government, that we were no longer, despite our best efforts, that we were no longer really on their side, that there wasn't a clear sense on our part about the day-to-day, week-to-week, in particular pocketbook concerns that they had, and that we had become tone deaf to those because we were so focused on what was happening inside the bubble, inside the government. There's an old saying, you're suffering from governmentitis.
Right.
You forget that you have to continue to sort of be in touch with the people and reflect on what it's like to walk a mile in their shoes. None of it was bad intentions, but I think, again, with time, you eventually kind of fall prey to that kind of phenomenon. So I think it's also really important for us as we rebuild to remember that it's not good enough anymore for us to simply say, okay, Marcel, you and I are going to disagree on a particular policy. When we disagree, instead of me finding a way as a leader to listen and to bring you along to my position, I'm just going to sit back and tell you you're wrong, and that perhaps your values are just a little bit kind of inferior, and kind of lecture at you. And I think, again, none of that was badly intended on certain policy issues, but I think after a while, the people of Ontario said, okay, we get it. We know you've delivered some good things, but A, it's time for a change, and B, we don't think you're on our side anymore. And so we're going to respond. We're going to punish you. And they punished us.
I tend to describe it as putting us in the penalty box.
Yeah, for a misconduct, I guess. It wasn't taking us to 7 seats. It's a significant time in the penalty box when you think about the fall, right?
So looking at that and seeing that we're at 7 seats, we lost all the supports that we normally would have had in opposition. The party has a significant deficit that it has to grapple with. Why would you want to be leader of this party?
I said right off the top, it's 31 years that I've been active in the party, and that time has given me, whether it was serving as a riding president, provincially or federally, a campus club president at U of T many years ago, a member of our central executive committee, obviously ultimately a candidate, MPP and minister. When Liberals are focused on the people that we are honored to represent, we deliver some pretty remarkable progress. When we are fiscally responsible and remember at all times that people work hard for the money they earn, but they also want to see progress, they want to see progressive policies, we can accomplish remarkable things. In all of my touring for the last year, more than 140 communities, I have yet to meet a single Ontarian who tells me they wish we were burning coal once again to produce our electricity, or they wish that we had gotten rid of full-day kindergarten, or they wish that we didn't have a green belt. These are all the kinds of progress-oriented policies that not only we ran on, not only we embraced, but we actually delivered. So I think that liberalism is a hopeful and optimistic political philosophy at its core. And I think the people of Ontario are hopeful and optimistic, and there's a good alignment there. And so I believe with my skills and my experience and my work ethic, I am strongly positioned to hit the ground running immediately after the convention in March, work harder than we've ever worked before, than I've ever worked before, relentlessly, so that we're ready for an election campaign. I call it the fight of our lives. I truly believe that. Because the only thing standing between where we are today as a province and where we want to be on public education, public health care, the environment and climate change, and the right kind of prosperous and also fair economy, there's only one obstacle, and his name is Doug Ford. And so we have to be ready for that fight. We have to beat him, and we have to find a way to get our province back on track.
So let's talk about some of the policies that you, as a future potential leader of the party, would like to see brought in. You've talked about a program for transit where you would have off-peak rates for commuters and have that available, and some other programs. Why don't you share some thoughts on that?
Sure. So I would say the most important place that we have to start, if I'm elected leader and ultimately premier in 2022, the number one place that we have to start is in education. It was after ripping up cap and trade and the climate change action plan, it was the next place that Doug Ford and his friends decided to zero in on with, dramatic and reckless cuts and frankly incompetent cuts. And so I tell people on the campaign, think back to what the world of education looked like in Ontario in terms of funding and programming at all levels. On June the 6th, 2018, the day before Doug Ford was elected as premier, I think as a first order of business for Ontario Liberals, we need to restore the funding and the programming, the class sizes, the number of teachers we have on the front lines, the support staff they have, all of that, the respect that all of those women and men are due, making university and college tuition once again affordable and accessible to everybody, regardless of income. That world that we had created up until June 7th, we have to restore that. So that's step number one. Education at all levels needs to once again become as effective as it possibly can be. We know that the public education system at all levels is what helps us create the strongest possible society, but also the strongest possible economy. And I say this as the guy who served for about 6 or 7 months as the economic development minister near the end of our last term in government. We've been successful in Ontario because for 15 years, we collectively invested in public education. We created a highly skilled workforce. That is our single greatest competitive advantage. And Doug Ford is doing, it seems, whatever he possibly can to try and just destroy that. So to me, that's the first order of business. I talked a second ago about how they ripped up cap and trade and the climate change action plan. Fortunately, after they did that, our federal government stepped in and decided that in Ontario, despite what Doug Ford wanted to do, carbon pollution should not be free. So we obviously have a price on carbon pollution today in Ontario, but there are a whole series of other programs that Doug Ford got rid of. For example, we know that the single largest emitting sector of greenhouse gas emissions is transportation. 35 or 36% of every greenhouse gas emission produced in Ontario comes from that sector. My wife and I decided 2 years ago to lease an electric car. Had that for the last 2 years, purely electric, no gas backup whatsoever. I love it. It's great. But I was able to do that in part because there was a good incentive coming from the provincial government, not just for the vehicle, but also for the home-based charging infrastructure. Doug Ford canceled all that. We have to redeploy funds. We have to invest in making it easier for people to transition to passenger vehicles, family vehicles that will actually be greener and lower carbon. The same thing goes for the charging infrastructure. At the end of the day, during this last federal campaign, the federal Liberal government ran on a platform. Here's another example of 2 billion trees over 10 years. Ontario represents about 40% of the country's population. I've committed, if elected leader and premier, we have to do our share. What's 40% of 2 billion? 800 million trees over 10 years. That's about 6 or 7 trees for every man, woman, and child each and every year for a decade. I believe Ontario can get that done. You mentioned the off-peak transit discount. I believe that it's time for us to make it more affordable for people to take transit, but in particular in off-peak times. We know, for example, in the GTA, and not just the GTA, Ottawa, Waterloo, elsewhere, most people tend to commute during peak hours, a peak hour in the AM and a peak hour in the PM. But we also know the world of work is adjusting and shifting just a little bit. If government makes the investment to send a very clear signal, let's say to the commuting market, that if you leave an hour later or 45 minutes earlier, you're going to save 50% off your transit fare. Not only will it make it more affordable for people to take transit, bring net new riders to the system, I'm convinced of that, it will also help to shave down some of those commuting peaks that are already overburdening systems like in Toronto, the TTC, for example, at Yonge and Bloor. So that's another thing that I've made a commitment to. And I'm excited about what we can accomplish and the kind of progress we can deliver. Again, if we're creative, if we're innovative, if we're what Ontario Liberals certainly can be.
Earlier, you mentioned one of the things that resulted in the devastating loss for the Liberals was we lost touch with every person out there. And one of the issues was, and this, that the Tories used effectively, was affordability.
Yeah.
And so where would you, as Liberal leader, want to take the party and ultimately the province to address the issue of affordability, which is becoming more and more pressing with each passing year?
I think there's a couple of key areas that we can look at helping families contend with the affordability or the anxieties, the affordability challenges or the anxieties they have. But I do think one of the most important things for us as Liberals, once again, is to remind voters that we do have a respect for how hard they work for the money that they earn. Just that simple sentence, which, of course, intuitively every Liberal does believe. We know that whether you're earning minimum wage or you're earning hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, you work hard for that money, and you have a clear expectation that it's quite appropriate for government to invest in crucial things for you and your family, using that money that you work hard to earn, that you transfer to government in taxes and in fees. That's all good. What people cannot stand is when they get a sense that government is not competently investing that money or is doing it carelessly or doesn't really care about the fact that they work really hard. They don't expect government's going to be perfect, but I do think they have an expectation, and rightly so, that government needs to be responsible. And I think just the simple act of reminding voters that we know deep in our souls, we get it, not just intellectually, but viscerally, that they do work hard for the money they earn, and that money belongs to them. They give it to us inside government so that collectively we can deliver public education, environmental protections, proper health care, and so on and so on and so on. I think that they'll understand what the value proposition is. There are a couple of areas where in day-to-day lives we could probably make things more affordable, and I'm probably going to be saying, or I will be saying more about that in the coming weeks. So no scoops here today, unfortunately. But I think it's important for us to acknowledge that we know how hard people work for the money that they earn, and that government needs to invest on their behalf in a responsible way.
So how do you plan on getting this message out to the broader public? You know, given that there's very limited resources available for the party, both in the legislature and outside, and if you are ultimately successful as leader, you're not going to have a seat in
That's also true.
Queen's Park.
Yeah. So, I mean, first of all, I think when it comes to anything communications related, I think it's important to keep the language straightforward and to keep the message simple and clear and consistent, and then repeat it. And repeat it over and over and over and over again. But the backdrop to all of that, which I think is the most important thing, and when Liberals do this properly, it's just remarkable to watch the outcome. When we fall back into our usual traps or fall victims to our usual kind of traps on this, it doesn't work as well. And that is, once again, learning how to communicate emotionally with voters. So, you know, voters are human beings. You know, they don't make their selections as if they were robots or computers. They make them at a visceral level. So it's important for our policies to be fact-based and research-based and the right things. That's all important, and we should always make sure that's our focus. But if we are not conveying to voters in that emotionally compelling way that gets them in their hearts and in their guts at a visceral level that we're on their side, that there's a value proposition for them to support us, we're going to lose them. Here's the classic example that I have used. And I say this recognizing that I'm as guilty, or have been as guilty from time to time as others. For 3.5 years, I served as transportation minister. And the most important transportation in the GTHA, the most important transportation project that we were embarking upon was Go Regional Express Rail.
Right.
Every time I got to a platform, and I did dozens of announcements on this, I would talk about it's a 10-year plan, it's $15 billion, it's going to take the number of trains that we run on the network from 1,500 a week to 6,000 a week, and when we're done, you're going to have two-way all-day Go service that's going to be electrified. I mean, in essence, that's kind of what I said. If you ask the average person on the street, what's the highest number you've ever counted to out loud in your life? And I've tested this on the road. Most people haven't even counted out loud beyond 100, maybe
Right.
200. If they're a teacher, maybe 500. Why do we as liberals think that if that's the case, people can kind of wrap their minds around $15 billion? So I think back on my time at transportation and I say, I wish I had stood on a Go Station platform and instead said, you know, over the next few years, Ontario Liberals will invest your hard-earned money responsibly. And when we're done, you're going to have so many trains running in your neighborhood. They're going to be electric, so they're going to be quieter and cleaner. And every single day, your commute from Newmarket to Union Station on the way down will be 10 minutes shorter or 7 minutes shorter, whatever the right number is. And your way home, it's going to be that much quicker as well. We're going to be giving you an hour back a week. You're going to use that hour to go to the gym, spend time with your loved ones, binge watch something on Netflix. People can touch and feel that. People can get that. Instead of doubling down on numbers and big complex policies, people just want to be, you know, convinced in that emotionally compelling way. And I think, you know, your question about how will you communicate that when you're under-resourced, it's true. There's no doubt there's a challenge in that regard. I have committed within the first 100 days, if I become leader, to raise enough money so that we can actually deploy, at the very least, a social media campaign that will help define our new leader and our new direction within those first 100 days. I'm optimistic that I will be able to make that happen. But I think the broader discussion is, how do we reach voters at a gut level? How do we reach them in their hearts instead of just focusing on the muscle that's between their ears? It's got to be all of it. Got to tell stories. We got to tell stories.
Well, this is something that I've been preaching for a long time.
I know. I know.
So it's music to my ears to hear that. Now, you say that you have a 100-day plan.
I do.
Can you share some of that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I put this out in, I think it was November or December. I wanted to demonstrate to the party faithful and all the people, I mean, nearly 30,000 additional people who've joined the party because of leadership, that I do have a clear sense. It's not just a platitude. It's not just, you know, a concept for a debate. I actually have a very clear plan for those first 100 days. I should note that the party has decided that our first annual general meeting post-leadership will be in June in London. So there actually is about 100 days that exist between the leadership convention and the AGM in June. In those 100 days, in addition to the social media ad campaign that I talked about a second ago, I've said that I will announce who the campaign chair or co-chairs are. I will announce who our nominations commissioner is so that we can start our nominating of candidates no later than July 1st of 2020. That's really important to me because...
Why?
Well, because we 124 seats in the legislature, and our caucus today stands at 6. I believe we're going to win both by-elections in Ottawa. That takes us up to 8. That means even if every single one of the sitting MPPs runs again, we have to find 116 candidates. We have to find them, search for them. We have to vet them. We have to nominate them, and do all of that inside 26 months. That's a lot of work to get done by a volunteer army, right? So I want to make sure that we are in a position no later than July 1st of 2020 to start that process, because I think it's horrible when you're nominating candidates into the actual election period. That's not good for the candidate, it's not good for the party, it's not good for the community that candidate wants to represent. I've talked about the need to make sure that we have our platform development process kick-started inside those first 100 days. To me, that's also essential. You know, we need a platform more so than ever before that actually conveys to the people of the province that we once again deserve their trust. You know, I didn't mention this in the earlier answer, but I think that was implied in my response about people felt that we were out of touch and no longer on their side. People lost their trust in us, you know, and so I think we need a platform that once again demonstrates that we are deserving of that trust, and that won't come easily or happen overnight. And it needs to capture every region of the province, not just the GTA, Ottawa, and Waterloo, though I love those three regions. If you live in the north, you have to see something there. If you live in the deep southwest, or you live on a farm or a small town, you have to see yourself and your hopes and aspirations reflected in that platform. So those are just some of the examples of how I would hit the ground running immediately following the convention. Now,
it's interesting that in your 100-day plan, I didn't hear anything about raising money and fundraising.
No, I did. I did announce that I would appoint a fundraising chair and that I would raise enough money in the first 100 days
to pay for a social media campaign.
To start with a social media campaign, yes.
Yeah. So how do you go beyond that and tackle the deficit or the debt that the party has and put it into a fighting form that will contest the next election?
Yeah, it's just hard work. So, I mean, I've been doing fundraising in this business, in our business for a number of years, and it's just hard work. There's no magic bullet. There's no easy way to do it. It's phone calls. It's, look, my campaign for leader, just a couple of days ago, we passed the $400,000 mark. I can tell you, as the person who is largely responsible for helping to raise most of that money, it was based on phone calls and outreach and the network and people wanting to talk about stuff and then having those conversations over and over and over again. We are blessed in the Ontario Liberal Party. We actually do have a large group of individuals from across this province who for many, many years gave small amounts on a monthly basis, gave the max donations. It's just about them feeling once again that they are part of this entire journey, part of this entire mission, and the leader, and mostly the leader, just making calls. And I know that doesn't sound sexy or glamorous or like there's any glory in it, but if a leader hops into the car and is going to meet with a bunch of Liberals or a university president or a hospital CEO in Windsor, well, that's nearly 4 hours in the car. It's 4 hours you can be on the phone raising money or talking to riding presidents or talking to other partners and stakeholders. That's when I said earlier that we have to work relentlessly, like harder than we've ever worked before. That's what the job looks like. And we need to be under no illusion that this is not 2013 when we had 400 paid political staff at Queen's Park ready there to do all that heavy lifting, or at least part of that heavy lifting. That doesn't exist this time around. That's going to fall to the leader, and it's going to fall to the volunteers of this party to action. And I know that I have the experience and the skills and the capacity to do that kind of work.
How would you categorize yourself in terms of on the political spectrum? Left, right, middle, center, center, right. Where would you say you fall in that spectrum?
Yeah, look, I consider myself to be fiscally responsible and socially, as Sean Chrétien says, socially preoccupied liberal. And that's the Liberal Party that I've grown up in for the more than 30 years that I've been active in the party. I don't, if we were to leave this studio and go outside and talk to a bunch of people and ask them if they were left or right or center, they'd be thinking about hockey. They wouldn't be thinking about politics. And I think sometimes those of us who are inside the business are a little bit too preoccupied with where we would plot ourselves or aspiring candidates on that notional spectrum. It's not about left or right. It's, it really is what policies are we embracing? How are we working to move the province forward? And there might be somebody who's a hardcore conservative who loves the idea that we're going to have small class sizes in primary school because their granddaughter is in primary school. That person's not thinking left or right. They're thinking about which government's on my granddaughter's side. And that's the government I want us to be once again as Ontario Liberals. I know there are people in this party, my party, our party, who are further left than me. And conversely, I know there are people in the party who are further right than me. One of the most important things for Ontario Liberals as we head into 2022 is to occupy as much political real estate, within reason, that exists on policies, on ideas, on listening to people. If we do that, if we create that kind of significant coalition across the board, we will absolutely be successful.
You earlier mentioned that one of the key things is that 2022 is going to be the provincial campaign and the fight of our life against Doug Ford. What if Doug Ford is not the premier or leader in 2022?
We can only deal with, we can't campaign, work, or live our lives with hypotheticals. In just a few weeks, a few months, Doug Ford will be at the midway point of his election, his government. Yep. And I fully expect he will be running again in 2022. And if he's not running again in 2022, we as a party will adjust and deal with that. But as much as Doug Ford is a symbol for everything that's gone wrong in Ontario in the last 19 or 20 months, Doug Ford is not alone. Every single person in that cabinet and caucus has gone along with dramatic cuts to public education, stripping away environmental protections, having no plan to fight the climate crisis, building an economy or growing an economy, not really though, but growing an economy that's not fair. So nobody gets off the hook just because Doug Ford might disappear. The broader principle about this is the fight of our lives because we want to have a real plan to fight the climate crisis. We want public education that works for everybody. We want public health care where patients truly are at the center of the decision-making process. We want all of that and more. Well, that's just not going to happen under a Conservative government, regardless of who might be leading them. But I'll say today that I'm quite convinced Doug Ford will be running in the next election.
All right. Well, we'll see whether that happens. Now, one of the things we saw in the last election is a number of Liberals bleed off to the NDP. And we saw a campaign that tried to appeal to NDP voters that really didn't achieve its objective. How do you bring back some of those Liberals to back to the fold?
I think there was a large chunk of the electorate that chose to vote NDP in the last half of the last election campaign because they didn't want Doug Ford. And though people in their day-to-day lives don't pay attention to politics the way that I do, the way that we do,
yes,
they do see the polls and they see what's happening in the news, even if they're only catching glimpses. And I think they knew towards the end of the last campaign that we were unlikely to be able to stop Doug Ford, we as Liberals. And so a large chunk of them decided to go not based on policy, not based on personality or ideology, simply which leader and which party is best positioned to avoid the disaster that has become Doug Ford, that is and has become Doug Ford. And so they chose the NDP. I think if Ontario Liberals are rebuilt in a way and we are properly resourced and we have that platform that I talked about earlier that is compelling and that we show our traditional coalition of supporters that we are able to stop Doug Ford, I think a lot of those people will come home because they will see in our policies, they will see in our readiness that we are the only alternative. I think it's also really important for Ontario Liberals to remind the electorate that on June 7th, 2018, we had conceded. Kathleen Wynne had conceded.
Exactly. I was going to raise that.
And Andrea Horwath, therefore, had the very best chance in more than a generation to prove to the people of this province that she and the NDP could stop Doug Ford from winning a majority government. And they failed. We only got 1 million votes, which compared to our traditional track record is nothing compared to, right? Relatively speaking, is much smaller than we traditionally get. And we'd conceded. And in the face of all that, Andrea Horwath and the NDP couldn't stop Doug Ford from winning a majority government. It's clear to me that they don't have, the NDP under Andrea Horwath or anyone else, doesn't have the capacity to be able to stop Doug Ford from winning a second majority government. So it does fall to Liberals to be that clear and viable alternative. We just have a lot of work to do to get to the point where that's easily demonstrated to the people of this province. But it is a really important goal and objective for me to make sure that we are positioned there and positioned there very, very strongly as quickly as we can possibly be.
Now, looking at Ontario politics and then just kind of extrapolating it to the federal level, the federal Liberals did extremely well in Ontario. In fact, that's probably what saved the party from any potential defeat. It ended up with a minority, but they won the vast majority of seats in Ontario. How do you think you can leverage any of that to help the provincial party?
So I had the real honor to campaign or canvass, and I think it was 73 federal ridings during the election, this past election. So knocked on doors with a lot of federal candidates or on behalf of a lot of federal candidates. Two things that I heard loudly and clearly at the doors. One, there was a very, very strong aversion to Doug Ford. It was a very, very strong, palpable feeling, and that existed in rural seats and suburban seats and urban seats in every region in Ontario, which I thought was not surprising, but it was in a way encouraging to see. People understood that, even though they knew that it was a federal campaign. They didn't want someone who kind of looked like or sounded like a Doug Ford conservative being in control of the country. I think, secondly, there was a clear understanding that the kinds of policies that the Prime Minister and the Federal Liberal Party were pursuing were the ones that delivered progress, whether it's climate change or it's the kind of economy or lifting people out of poverty or investments in transit infrastructure, a whole more affordable cell bills, like a whole bunch of things wrapped into that federal platform. And I think voters in this province said, we want progress, and we know we can't get progress with Doug Ford Part 2. And that, combined with, I think, a strong campaign performance by the Prime Minister and his team, I think ultimately won the day. And so there are things that we as provincial Liberals can extract from that, which is that, yes, we know that Doug Ford has a fairly unpopular track record so far, but that's just not going to fall into our laps. Power is not going to fall into our laps. We're not entitled to govern in this province. We have to earn it every step of the way. How do we earn it? With the ideas. Are those ideas compelling? Are we showing people that we deserve their trust again? Are we showing people that we're humble as we go back and look to seek or look to earn their trust again? And I think if we do that, we will have a lot of success.
Going into the convention, the media and others have said that you appear to have the lion's share of delegate support. Well, not the ones, sorry, let me rephrase.
No problem.
The people who have pledged to be your delegates versus the other campaigns. Does that put any additional pressure on you that you're perceived as a front runner?
I don't think it's a question of pressure. I think that I started campaigning just about a year ago. I have been working at this essentially full-time for a year. I have traveled a lot. I've toured a lot. I have not taken many days off in the course of the year. In fact, over the Christmas holidays, I had a bit of a break and I managed to get bronchitis. So that just goes to show when your system's feeling a little bit vulnerable, I guess things like that take over. Look, I am greatly encouraged by the success that we've had so far in the campaign. I am blessed to be surrounded by an extraordinary team of campaign workers and volunteers from all over the province. They are an exciting group to work with. We have brought in nearly 15,000 new members to the party, which is a huge number, far exceeding my original goal from months ago. I mentioned earlier, we've raised the most money for our campaign, now north of $400,000, and we will have somewhere in the neighborhood of 2,500 people running to be delegates for me across the province. All of that is encouraging. I've been around the business long enough to know until the votes are actually cast and in the ballot boxes and counted, nothing else matters. But I also know equally there are no shortcuts to success in life, that it really does just boil down to hard work and being relentless. And I will continue to work hard. I will continue to work hard throughout this leadership process. Let me also say the other 5 candidates, all of whom entered the race at different times, are all working really hard too. And so are their teams. And I've seen slates of leadership candidates going back many, many years, as we talked about. It's a great slate of candidates running for leader of our party right now. We are blessed to have a really good mix, 3 women, 3 men, different perspectives, different ideas. If I win the leadership, absolutely, I'm going to keep working as hard as I can to beat Doug Ford and get Ontario back on track. And if I don't win the leadership, I'll be doing the exact same thing. I'll be proud to serve under any one of the other 5 if they become leader, and I will do whatever I can to help them and help our party, because Doug Ford has to go, and only Ontario Liberals can make that happen.
Steven, on that note, I'd like to thank you for stopping by and sharing some of your thoughts.
Thanks so much, Marcel.